In 1775, the nation of England was at war in her North American colonies. But this war was different. She was not fighting a foreign nation, but rather she was fighting herself. After extensive research and the study of the American Revolution, I want to bring into question the legitimacy of the term revolution when it is used to describe America's political break with England. Now, since the creation of this nation, everyone has been taught in elementary, high school, and college that our forefathers were the engineers of a revolution, that they were the leaders of this revolution. But I beg to differ. Today, I'm going to present to you definitions, examples, and written statements that will remove the term revolution and replace it with the term Civil War. But in order for us to say whether the American War for Independence was a revolution or a civil war, we first have to define what each of these conflicts are. Jeff Goodwin, professor from New York University, defines a revolution as any and all instances in which a state or a political regime is overthrown and thereby transformed by a popular movement in irregular, extra-constitutional and or violent fashion. Now, some could argue that this is an opinionated definition. I agree. But let's back it up and compare it with a universally accepted definition found in the dictionary. It says, a revolution is a radical and pervasive change in society and the social structure, especially one made suddenly and often accompanied by violence. Again, both of these definitions have violence. By comparing them, we can establish that a revolution is a sudden and violent overthrow of the government. So, with these definitions in mind, let's look at examples. Perhaps the most common revolution that comes to mind is the French Revolution, and it's characterized by the guillotine. King Louis XVI is violently and suddenly removed from power. He has his head cut off by the guillotine. It is estimated that 20,000 to 40,000 innocent civilians were slaughtered in 10 months during this revolution. Let's go even further. What about the Russian Revolution? Tsar Nicholas is removed from power in 1917. His entire family, including himself, his young daughters, his young sons, are murdered, and estimated 9 million people were killed in the course of this revolution. So honestly, I want you to truthfully ask yourself, can the American Revolution be compared to these definitions and these examples from history? Now, with the revolution in mind, what about a civil war? Well, a civil war is defined in the Geneva Convention by 4 points. These 4 points being, the insurgents are in possession of a part of the national territory. An insurgent authority is exercising control over a population in the national territory and is responsible for its acts, meaning it has government, it has accountability, it has law. And the legitimate government has recognized insurgents as belligerents. That just means the insurgents are aggressive, they're showing warlike behavior. And fourth, the legal and legitimate government is obliged to have recourse to a regular military force against insurgents organized as military, meaning the legitimate government can send troops to put down this uprising. Now, we can all agree that the American Civil War of 1861 is a perfect example to look at as a civil war. Let's see if it is a civil war. The insurgents are in charge of national territory, the southern states. An insurgent authority, the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. And the legitimate government has recognized insurgents as belligerents, with the Confederates attacking the Union fort, Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And the legal government taking military action would be Abraham Lincoln sending soldiers into the southern states. So we know for a fact that the American Civil War was indeed a civil war. Now let's compare the criteria for a civil war with the events of the American Revolution. We have a party in revolt, would be the colonists, would be the 13 colonies. We have an insurgent authority, the Continental Congress, and in a belligerent insurgency would be the attacks on the British soldiers, the skirmishes of Lexington and Concord. And the legal government, taking military action, would be King George III, the King of England at this time, sending soldiers and supplies into the 13 colonies to put down the rebellion, just as Abraham Lincoln did with the Confederate States of America. The criteria for a civil war follows exactly with the events of the American War for Independence. Now, we've defined a civil war, we've looked at a revolution, but the importance of the citizenship cannot be overlooked because it helps the cause in naming this conflict a civil war. See, Sam Vaknin wrote in the American Revolution that the American Revolution was a civil war, and it was between loyalists and patriots. But before there ever was the loyalist or the patriot, there was the English citizen. Now the English citizen, or the definition of a citizen rather, sorry, is a member of a state who owes allegiance to a government and is entitled to protection from it. The individuals who were living in 13 colonies were naturalized English citizens, just as you and I are naturalized American citizens to the United States of America. Now, the 13 colonies were the only place that England owned that allowed to have naturalized citizens. The colonies in Africa, in the Middle East, and in India all were subjects. They were not citizens. So when the individuals in the colonies rose up, they were rising up against their fellow citizens and against their government, just as the Confederate States rose up against their government and their American citizens. So we've defined the Revolution, we've defined a Civil War and citizenship, but there's one point that helps distinguish a revolution from a civil war, and that's when James Farron of Stanford University states, Civil war refers to a conflict between organized groups within a country that are fighting. I emphasize organized, because when we looked at the revolution, it was mob control. There was no law, there was no authority. They were targeting anyone. Thousands of innocent civilians were killed. But that's not the case in the American Civil War. That wasn't the case in the American War for Independence. In the American Civil War, we had the United States of America and the Confederate States of America with laws. We had blue, gray-clad soldiers fighting each other, specifically targeting each other. They weren't slaughtering innocent civilians. In the American War for Independence, we had King George III, and we had the Continental Congress. Red and blue-clad soldiers fighting each other. Again, they weren't killing innocent civilians. Civil wars are organized conflicts between governments and armies, not targeting innocent civilians. What I've proposed to you is a radical break from tradition, but reasoning through these examples and definitions dictates that the American War for Independence was indeed an English Civil War. By looking back in the speech, a revolution is a sudden and violent overthrow of a government. King George III was never removed from the throne. There was no guillotine set up in North America. Thousands of innocent civilians were not being slaughtered. It was an organized conflict between people of the same nation. Sons and fathers were fighting each other. The citizens of the English crown were fighting each other. See, we gained our independence through a civil war, and it was gained through an English Civil War.